So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Teresa Hackett, and I'm the Copyright and Libraries Programme Manager at EIFL, Electronic Information for Libraries. That's an international NGO that works with libraries in developing and transition economy countries. I'd like to welcome you to our session today at the Global Congress on IP, which is entitled Copyright and Licensing, Challenges for Libraries. And this session is presented jointly with EIFL, the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions. So in our session today, we will review key challenges facing libraries around copyright, licensing, and access to library collections. It will focus especially on digital issues that have emerged or that have gained a new urgency during the COVID pandemic. Like, for example, remote access to library resources, ebooks, digital research, that's text and data mining, digital lending services, and public lending right, a related issue. Now, of course, the pandemic of itself didn't create new legal problems, but what it did do was it highlighted the role of copyright in providing access, and it dramatized tensions that had already existed in this space. And what we saw quickly emerging was there were really three worlds. So we have the haves. So these were the countries that where the copyright laws were resilient and able to support access to education and learning during lockdowns when libraries were closed. Then we had the countries that were the have-nots. So where their laws did not permit those activities. And then in the middle, we had the don't knows, or the maybe the not sures. So there were many countries where it wasn't clear whether these activities that were needed to provide remote access and to support learning during COVID, during lockdowns, were lawful or not. So it accelerated a debate on the regulation of access to information for the public good, and the need for proper sustainable solutions for libraries and other cultural heritage institutions. So in our session today, we'll have short presentations by 4 experts and practitioners, followed by an opportunity to ask questions and to make other observations. And today we are being interpreted from English and Spanish. So we're grateful to our interpreters for providing that service to us. I'm going to introduce each of our speakers in turn. So our first speaker is Ariadna Matas. Ariadna is policy advisor at the Europeana Foundation, where she contributes to the development of Europeana's policies on copyright. Ariadna has a master's in intellectual property law, and she studied in Spain, in Germany, and in France. Before joining Europeana, Ariadna worked for EIFL on copyright matters. So today, Ariadna is going to talk to us about digitization and remote access to library collections. So Ariadna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Teresa. Let me just quickly share my screen. You can see my slides, right?
We can.
Okay. Great, thank you. And thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this panel. I believe these are very important topics to discuss. So I'll be giving a quick presentation on how Europeana supports remote access to digital cultural heritage. So I'll be speaking particularly from the perspective of Europeana, which does the function of a European-wide online like digital library. So I'll particularly be talking about remote access, understood as online access, so accessible to anyone who has access to the internet. And I'll be giving a couple of examples why we believe remote access is so important, in particular online access, free as much as possible from copyright barriers. And then I'll be talking about some of the copyright challenges that we face as we want to make digital cultural heritage available online. And we'll also try to explain a little bit how we tackle them and some of the remaining challenges that we are facing. And starting with a few examples of some of the benefits we have seen of great things happening when digital cultural heritage is made available online. So starting with the positives, the area of education is one that Europeana cares a lot about. So we want to make sure that educators can find the right material for their teaching activities when they navigate Europeana, so that cultural heritage from Europe can be brought into the classroom. We do that through many different activities and different formats. An example are what we call the learning scenarios. So we already have digital cultural heritage made available on Europeana, and then we invite a network of teachers to create specific exercises around that would help a student navigate a specific topic, so a learning experience, and bring digital cultural heritage from Europeana into these learning scenarios. So it's an exercise with hands-on material so that students can get familiar with the actual heritage that they're talking about. During the pandemic, that proved to be really useful, in particular because the cultural heritage that we were talking about was already online. So we could quickly adapt to creating learning scenarios that could be used remotely from home as teachers and students were doing distant learning. Another very good example of why libraries, archives, museums should be able to make their heritage available online as widely as possible is because it supports creativity. In here, I just wanted to flag a specific example, but that I particularly like. Merete Sanderhoff explains in this tweet how the institution that she works for, the Statens Museum Kunst in Denmark, created 3D scans of sculptures they have in their collections, made them available online, and how these 3D scans now have been useful for a filmmaker, in this case, Lucio Arese, to create a short film depicting these sculptures and being reinterpreted from his perspective. What is particularly interesting here is that the museum managed to clear rights in this case, because the material is in the public domain, I imagine, and also had a very open policy of not imposing any other type of barriers. So they could take these 3D scans, so the sculpture outside of the walls of their institution, and the 3D scans even outside of the walls of their own website, because they go on and try to look for audiences where they are. So in this case, they had made available the 3D scans through platforms that are widely used by creators to find content that they can use in their works. So this, without having cleared all these copyright barriers, it would have been impossible to go so far in meeting the actual audience that is interested in using this material. Another clear benefit that we see when we share digital cultural heritage online is how we can connect it with audience that can help us enrich the heritage. There are several campaigns going on in many institutions, and this is just one example of a project that Europeana participates in. It's called the Transcriber Fund, and through this project, a platform was built that displays digital cultural heritage made available on Europeana and invites citizens from any part of the world to help transcribe handwritten documents, geolocate them, and also tag them. So when this data is fed back to Europeana, the searchability, findability of the items are a lot more agile, and they can even be searched through the content that they display, which was in principle not machine readable, at least not with the technology that we have available. But having this infrastructure, technology, and even having the heritage there to use is not sufficient when we want to make digital cultural heritage available online and reusable, because there are many copyright challenges that need to be addressed on the way. So it's really a kind of copyright minefield when we talk about online access and reuse, unfortunately. So there are several steps through which copyright questions arise from the very first moment when the work is digitized, because digitizing requires making a reproduction. The moment the works are made available online, this is also an act that triggers copyright protection. It's a communication to the public. when we work online, it means we work across borders. So we no longer focus on one single jurisdiction, but need to take into consideration differences from one border to the other. And then if we want to support the use of the digital objects by an educator or a creator, new questions arise as well, because they might be distributing, communicating to the public, or reproducing the work. So I wanted to give you a few pointers at how Europeana has been trying to address some of these challenges. And before I do that, just a quick note on how Europeana functions so that you understand the context that we're working with. So Europeana makes available thumbnails, metadata, that it also stores. But all these thumbnails and metadata and the actual digital objects, they come from around 4,000 cultural heritage institutions from across Europe. So what you see in this screen is on the left-hand side, the cultural heritage being made available on the website of the providing institution. And on the right-hand side, you see how it is displayed then that same item on Europeana. So in reality, when I talk about having to resolve copyright challenges, the ones that need to do that are the many institutions that contribute data to Europeana. And it is very important for Europeana to make sure that they can overcome these challenges. Otherwise, Europeana would not exist, if I'm being very, very pessimistic. So there are several challenges that need to be addressed by the many cultural heritage institutions that we work with. In very broad terms, there are a couple of tools at their service to try to overcome copyright issues. If we look at the 4 pointers that I was giving before, when they go for the digitization of an item, in Europe we are lucky enough to have exceptions to copyright that allow for the preservation of a work. They're slowly getting better, and while they are not perfect, they cultural heritage professionals have enough relative confidence that they can digitize a large part of their collection without having to worry about the legal consequences. But when it comes to making digital reproductions available online, it becomes a lot trickier. An ideal scenario would be one where the items are in the public domain and there are no rights to be cleared. But that would be the ideal scenario for the other points as well. But there are in copyright works that need to be shared online, so that is definitely not always the case. So cultural heritage institutions may rely on copyright exceptions to copyright, but currently they are difficult to apply or insufficient, I would say. The other option is to try to clear rights. So go item by item, trying to locate every rights holder and ask for permission. Unless this has been done at the very beginning when the items were given to the institution, if rights were obtained then as well. But rights clearance one by one is extremely time-consuming, so it's almost not an option for many cultural heritage institutions. And the remaining option, which is clearly not an ideal one, would be going for a risk assessment and deciding, is there a big legal risk, or can we make this available online, knowing that the rights holder will never ever complain, and that no harm will be generated no actual harm will be generated for anyone. And then if we talk about working across borders, the only way out is harmonization of legal frameworks or relying on some sort of legal fiction that allows us to operate online. I guess we're lucky enough to see that in Europe there is progress being made in this direction, but international progress would be much better, of course. And there are still some gaps to fill in the harmonization process. And last but not least, if we then want to support the use of these digital objects by others, by teachers, creators, researchers, they sometimes have copyright exceptions in place, but they are sometimes a bit fragmented and insufficient, again. And one thing we do to try to fill in this gap is rely as much as possible on Creative Commons licenses, Creative Commons tools, and rights statements. So standardized rights information that can help users immediately grasp what can be done with the digital cultural heritage that they discover through Europeana. So in conclusion, it's like really about juggling with many different steps and many different possible, sometimes insufficient solutions that cultural heritage institutions need to navigate if we want to ensure that cultural heritage institutions meet their public interest mission and can connect the heritage with the right audience. So there's still a lot of gaps to be filled in terms of harmonization, in terms of exceptions to make digital cultural heritage available online, and especially in terms of liability for cultural heritage professionals working with digital cultural heritage. So I'll leave it at that for now, and looking forward to any questions or discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ariadna. I think that gave a very good overview and an introduction to some of the practical issues that cultural heritage institutions are dealing with on a day-to-day and a regular basis. And I think your comment that at the beginning of the pandemic that a lot of the material was already available online so that you could quickly adapt to providing access to that material when the lockdowns happened suddenly overnight without any time to prepare. I think that's very important because so we need to be ready for situations that are unexpected and that might happen, whether it's the next pandemic or it's as a result of climate change or whatever. So I think that's a very important lesson that we can take forward. So with that, I'm going to hand over to our second speaker, who is Ben White. Ben is a researcher at the Centre for Intellectual Property and Management at Bournemouth University in the UK. But right now, Ben is not in the UK. Ben is on the other side of the world in Tokyo, and it's rather late in the evening for Ben this evening. So we're very grateful to Ben for coming along and joining our session. Ben is a leader in Knowledge Rights 2021, which is a new 3-year program that aims for long-term copyright reform for the benefit of library users and researchers in the digital environment. Before joining Bournemouth University, Ben was head of intellectual property at the British Library, and he participated in a European Commission funded project called Future TDM, Text and Data Mining, that was about barriers on the uptake of data analytics and artificial intelligence technologies. And to his knowledge, Ben was the first person in Europe to call for an exception on text and data mining in 2008. So I think that's an accolade to have to your CV. So Ben is going to talk to us about a couple of other issues: ebooks, text and data mining, and interlibrary loan or interlibrary document supply. That's an issue that's very dear to my own heart. So Ben, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Can I just check that you can see my slides okay? Great.
Yes, we can see them. Okay. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much to EIFL and EIFL for inviting me this evening, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and in my case, good night to everyone. I have to thank my co-panelist Jennie for this, who sent me this amazing article in Wired, and I think this encapsulates absolutely perfectly the importance of libraries and lending. If you remember at the beginning of the pandemic, the belief from the World Health Organization was that COVID was primarily transmitted through surfaces and droplets on surfaces. And then after a number of months, that rapidly changed. And the reason that the WHO changed its advice and advised that COVID was in fact largely airborne and that people should wear face masks is in large part due to this here, where scientists in the US were skeptical that corona was not airborne. And they did research into the history of around the health conclusion as to why corona was transmitted via surfaces and not airborne, although aerosol specialists' view was from the start that it was likely to be airborne. And essentially what they did through libraries finding a book from 1955 that had been digitized, they were able to trace the 60-year-old mistake in transmissible diseases that led to the WHO conclusion that corona was not airborne. So without a library having access to this 1955 book, and of course during COVID when people couldn't visit the library, without it being digitized, and it was an in-copyright book, and without librarians making the decision to, as it was in America, shelter under fair use and lend that book, then more people may have died because WHO would have been potentially slower at issuing advice for people to wear face masks. We have other examples of this, for example, in the most recent Ebola outbreak in West Africa, that I think it's Liberia believed that Ebola was not endemic, whereas in fact, German scientists in the 1970s had discovered that Ebola was endemic. And that misconception in the health authorities, sorry, it was Sierra Leone, that misconception in the health authorities there meant that they didn't prepare for Ebola outbreak. So there are, numbers of cases where, in very emotive cases in the medical field, where a lack of access to information has cost lives. And I think this is a absolutely perfect example of the importance of libraries being able to lend digitally, because that's under threat. In the UK, I'm lucky enough to have some great colleagues at the eBook SOS campaign who have highlighted very effectively, and I've put in the chat a link to a great new video that they've done. They've highlighted very effectively the inabilities or the challenge that publishers are posing to the future of libraries being able to lend electronically. So one of the challenges that libraries in many countries face regarding ebooks is the cost. So as you can see there, price gouging from COVID, student ebooks costing 500% more than the equivalent paper book. And when I say equivalent, I do mean equivalent. So I mean a single seat user license can be, in this case, 5 times, but 10 times is not that rare. So the equivalent ebook compared to a paper book is 10 times the cost, although only one person can access that ebook at any one time. And of course, as our libraries have been shut, many libraries' budgets in university budgets have only been available to purchase e-material, and that has come at a huge cost. So thinking about public libraries also face the same challenge. The rule of thumb in the UK is that the equivalent ebook for a library is something like 3 to 4 times the equivalent of the paper book. And for audiobooks, it's even higher, so something like 6 times the cost of an e-audio book compared to a cassette or a CD. So we have extreme pressure coming on university, on research, and on public libraries. And that's just the start of it. We have issues which are not unique to the UK by any stretches of the imagination. There's a lack of licensing models. Publishers are refusing to license titles to libraries. Of course, in the analog world, the library is free to buy and lend any book it so chooses. But this isn't the case in a world of licensing. So licensing and the transition to ebooks is meaning that libraries are paying over the odds for titles, have poor licensing models, are being refused the ability to purchase or license ebooks. And they're also not able to buy individual titles. So of course, in the paper world, if a library wants one book from one publisher, it can buy that. But we see bundling of ebooks where it's not possible to buy a single title. So what that means is if you go essentially with one publisher or one platform, then your budget shrinks and you have less to buy elsewhere. So bundling, again, undermines the abilities of libraries to offer large collections. So if you think about what libraries have done for hundreds of years, arguably thousands of years, is they've been free with analog material to purchase whatever they want, to develop collections, to lend those collections to individuals as well as to other libraries, and to preserve their collections as well. And all three of those things are being undermined by ebooks. You're not free to develop a collection if a publisher won't license them to you. You're not free to develop a collection if you have to buy 100 books when you just want one, meaning your budget isn't there to purchase other material. Licenses will prevent preservation. I don't know what that ping is, I'll ignore it.
That's okay.
So licenses prevent preservation, and licenses and technical protection measures prevent the ability of a library to loan a book from one library to the other. Something which I applied for today. There was an article I wanted. It wasn't at Waseda University, so I applied to get that article from the National Diet Library. So Interlibrary Loan, again, a sort of a rather neglected area of this, but a backbone of research. So the solution to this is controlled digital lending, which I'm hoping Jennie will talk about. And essentially what this is in law, the ability for libraries to purchase any paper book or acquire any paper book, scan it in, and then lend it on an what's called an owned to loan ratio. If you have 2 copies, you can lend 2 digital copies and put your 2 paper copies, beyond public use. If you've got 3 copies, you're free to maybe lend 1 paper copy and then lend electronically 2. So on an owned to loaned basis. And what this will do is mean that libraries' research can function as it has done for hundreds of years again, which, as I said, is being radically undermined by ebooks and the move to licensing. In Europe, there is a very interesting court case from 2016 at the Court of Justice of the European Union, which essentially ruled that libraries are able, under existing directives, to purchase, license, get hold of any ebook on the marketplace and then lend that book. So that's the principle in European law, that no new laws are needed, that it's currently allowed under European law. Then we have to look at member state law to see how that ruling sort of filters through member state laws to see whether e-lending by libraries is legal or not. So moving away from copyright law, the eBook SOS campaign is in dialogue with the Competition and Markets Authority. And that is because from a competition law perspective, we believe that there may be issues around things like refusal to license, bundling, the high prices, they're all indicative of a poorly functioning market, which is essentially what competition authorities are there to solve. Interlibrary loan, this is, as I said earlier, essentially one library lending to another. That's what happened with the Wired article. This book, it was available, they'd obviously digitized it, and it was available for lending from one library to another. And of course, this is vitally important because no library can own all books. So in order to support research, you have this library infrastructure where if you haven't got the book or the article or maybe the sound recording or the film locally, laws allow one library to lend to another in certain jurisdictions. And this is a backbone of research, and still is, as per that article in Wired. So the issue that we have here is one country might have an exception that allows libraries to lend a book from one library to another. Another country might not, or it might have flexibilities in copyright law to allow lending from one library to another, but the laws are slightly different. So what happens when they cross borders? And this sort of grayness between the interlibrary lending laws in one country and another is why we need a solution at the international level to this. And it's this grayness which the scientific, technical and medical publishers exploited to stop the British Library, which was probably the largest interlibrary loan library in the world, from doing document supply, i.e. photocopying copies of book chapters and journal articles and sending those abroad. So because of the questions around how, when it goes, the copy goes cross borders, how this stacks up in terms of copyright law, was used to stop interlibrary loan. Unfortunately, this was not addressed in the Digital Single Market Directive in 2019, Europe's latest large bit of copyright legislation. And of course, controlled digital lending. We have technical protection measures which stop lending, and we have licenses which will stop, I'm sure, interlibrary loan. So this is fundamental to research, and yet the transition from digital, the lack of copyright laws are meaning that this backbone of research is really being threatened in the digital environment. And at the bottom there, a lot of people will say, well, open access is the answer. Open access is a partial solution. Not everything will ever be open access, and of course historical material is not. So we've got to get away, I think, in advocacy communities from tunnel vision around the answer is open access or the answer is copyright reform. The answer is both. Moving on to data analytics, the last couple of slides. Data analytics is essentially the use of computers to analyze data. Research considerations are not part of the international treaties at the WIPO level. And essentially the kind of growing number of text and data mining, data analytics, AI-oriented copyright legislations that we're seeing are mainly in Europe, Japan, and then fair use countries. So the majority of countries, although this is a modern form of research, will not have laws that allow text and data mining. And of course, given that the largest resource of third-party copyright materials that are being mined by scientists and companies, of course, is the internet, which, last time I checked, there wasn't somebody that licensed the internet. Essentially means that the only way forward, which is what we are seeing in an increasing number of jurisdictions, is limitations and exceptions that allow data analytics or machine learning, AI, call it what you want. This is a little table which I haven't got time to go into, but if you're interested in this, this is my sort of compare and contrast. The summary of this is probably if you're a non-commercial researcher, then the European solution is the best, Article 3. Then if it's commercial data mining, I think fair use is obviously very strong, but in terms of a dedicated exception, I think probably the best one is the Japanese exception. And that's it. So thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Ben, for that comprehensive but succinct presentation on a number of really important issues. I've put into the chat a link to a blog that we wrote in 2015 on the British Library International Document Supply Service that you mentioned earlier, where EIFL put in a freedom of information request to the British Library to get the data and some of the facts on how the service had changed when it became a licensed service rather than that operated under a copyright exception. So you can see that how the numbers had really fallen off dramatically and how it had a really devastating effect on what was a really great service. So with that, we're going to hand over now to our third speaker of the day, who is Jennie Rose Halpern. Jennie is the Executive Director of Library Futures in the US. Jennie joined Library Futures from Harvard Law School Library, where she served as the Assistant Director for Outreach and Community Engagement. And previous to that, Jennie managed communications for Creative Commons. So Jennie will talk a little bit more about controlled digital lending that Ben has mentioned, which became a really big issue that came to the fore in particular during the pandemic, and it has triggered widespread interest and not without some controversy as well. Yesterday, there was another session at the Global Congress, which was attended by Jennie and Ben, where the issue of controlled digital lending was spoken about in more detail, and I'm going to put a link to the recording of that event into the chat. So if you'd like to follow up more on controlled digital lending, I recommend you to take a look at that session because it was very, very informative. So Jennie, the floor is yours. Thank you. Jennie, can you unmute for yourself there? Thank you.
All right, yes. Trying again.
Thank you.
So thank you to the organizers of this conference, and thank you so much to Teresa for your kind introduction, and to the presenters and to the interpreters who are really working to make this as accessible as possible. My name is Jennie Rose Halperin, and I am the Executive Director of Library Futures, as Teresa said. And I'm going to start this whole thing off with a fairly provocative statement, which is that there are no non-exploitive licenses for libraries in the public sector. Libraries have to own materials digitally and physically in order to fulfill their purpose. And so what I like to ask is, the question of, is this the end of library ownership? Is this what we're going to see in the next 25 years? And I'll get back to that in just a moment. So this is sort of what we're going to talk about in the next 5-10 minutes, and I'll move fairly quickly through these slides, but I'm happy to share them afterward. And folks who work with Europeana might recognize some of these GIFs, which are some of my favorite things on the internet. So a good amount of this draws from the 2016 book, The End of Ownership by Aaron Perzanowski and Jason Schultz, who I have the true delight of getting to work with. From Jason is at NYU and Aaron is at Case Western. Their work really opened my eyes to how the world has transformed from an ownership model to a subscription or a rental model. And this shift is, at least in the United States, I can't speak for other contexts, but I think that Ben and Ariadna did an excellent job, and Luis yesterday as well, did an excellent job talking about how this is also legally incomprehensible in other places, as well as in the United States. But in the United States, this shift is pretty legally strange, right? But it's also one that the courts have upheld over and over again, and it's going to be in front of them again in Hachette versus Internet Archive, which is ongoing litigation on the issue. And so libraries absolutely have to evolve to meet the changing needs of patrons and users. And they definitely play a crucial role in a balanced publishing ecosystem. Public libraries alone account for at least $1.5 billion in publisher revenue every year. That's just collections budgets, not including academic or special or corporate libraries. And the estimate is between $4 and $5 billion in a maybe $50 or $60 billion industry, $8 billion of which is upheld by Relics or Elsevier. Happy Open Access Week, now the largest publisher in the world. So libraries do have to evolve, but they do not have to, in the words of a recent article, be reduced to what is called e-peonage. So what do libraries look like in the age of the end user licensing agreement? So licensing, as I said, I believe, is at its core exploitative. And it is by design in that way. So for, to give a pretty pat example that maybe doesn't relate as much to libraries, but this is an example that's given a lot, is that for the Facebook terms of service, for example, it would take someone 72 days to read the fine print. And yet these are agreements that we agree to every time we use a service or a piece of software. And you can see that having pretty deleterious effects in libraries as well. So for example, in the United States, Westlaw and Lexis, through their parent organizations and companies, Relics and Thomson Reuters, were selling data to police and to immigration, customs, and enforcement, putting patrons at risk, putting legal clients at risk. And I highly recommend reading Sarah Lambden's work on this piece and her upcoming book, Data Cartels. So taking it out of what is bad, what we see is when people collaborate, when libraries collaborate, when they own the terms of their engagement with digital materials, they can leverage more power and control. So Project Reshare, the work of consortia around the United States, through data ownership and open licensing, and ownership and dissemination, through even projects like Simply E, which is an open source content provider for libraries and is responsive to libraries' needs. We see that libraries are able to actually leverage more power and more control over their resourcing. So to recap, licenses are essentially an unworkable legal concept that, in the words of Schultz and Perzanowski, create a quote unquote market for lemons, which I really love. It's a private regulatory scheme with restrictions. So this is just an example from the United States of what trade publication terms might look like. So this is from a paper by Carmi Parker, which was done for Readers First, on pricing limitations. And she is a fairly pro-license librarian, and Readers First takes a pro-license, better terms for licensing stance. And so this is to say that there is a split, that some libraries are just kind of think that this is okay. And then, for organizations like ours, the entire concept of licensing is not sort of what we espouse. And the reason why is because, as I will say later in my presentation, libraries do not need permission to lend books. some of these terms are fairly arbitrary. So for example, why 26 times versus 25 times? And when people are paying cost per circulation, that's not the way that libraries work. That's not the way that libraries have ever worked. The concept of first sale and exhaustion are crucial to the formation of libraries in the United States and are crucial to the legal context around libraries. Why digital should suddenly be different is pretty unclear. And what I see is it's just a space for publishers to exploit libraries and also use public funds in ways that are not good. So not going to talk that much about academic libraries, but there are a number of organizations. Again, it is at Open Access Week, as well as IP Week, a pretty exciting week. There are plenty of organizations that are working on this issue. We are working on this issue broadly in a meta sense for all libraries. And so I would encourage you to look at SPARC or SPARC Europe and Authors Alliance as well, which are both in our coalition. So this is just another example of how, budgets and pricing is pretty skewed in legal challenges to the licensing schema in New York, Maryland, and Rhode Island. Librarians have often submitted this bill that with lists of books that include kind of how off the pricing is, just because they're lent, right? And so there has been absolutely no evidence or any kind of data that asserts that there really even needs to be so much friction. And that's the idea for the cost is, there's this idea that, well, libraries are lending, so we should up the price. But, as Michelle Wu pointed out in an earlier session a few days ago, there has been a used book market for hundreds of years. So again, why should digital be significantly different? Digitization has been proven to increase readership and sales by 32%, any sale by 92%, particularly for mid-list or less read authors. In shrinking the mid-list, what publishers are doing is they're skewing library purchases toward bestsellers, toward more white authors, toward authors who are just kind of on these lists of bestsellers, and it's making it so that libraries cannot build their collection of digital materials. At a recent symposium, Dave Hansen, one of the authors of the Controlled Digital Lending white paper, promise I will get there, had a debate about controlled digital lending with a lawyer named Devin Hartline. And Devin Hartline argued, well, if something's not available, it's just not available. So my question would be, is this the kind of future digital library that we would want? And also, even further, what about the entire 20th century in the United States? Do we just want digital libraries where the entire 20th century, the 21st century, is just inaccessible for the next 100 years? This has huge impacts on education. This has huge impacts on library resourcing. And again, not a theoretical concept, as Ben pointed out from that excellent Wired article. This could potentially save lives. It could, create an entire community of researchers. And, Chris Lewis says in a really excellent podcast about digital ownership with the Electronic Frontier Foundation from last fall, he says, the internet has so many possibilities. Why are we cutting it off at the knees? Why are we not allowing, the full potential of the internet to be realized because of these entrenched rights holders who, want to block everything and, don't want to, in the words of Maria Palante, defend copyright from all challenges. So to recap, pricing isn't just about expenditure of public resources and the ways in which publishers are expecting libraries to purchase content over and over and over again, but it's definitely a major issue. It's also about how we're curating and building knowledge collections for the communities we serve. The skewing of pricing toward large corporations, bestsellers, and publishing executives means that collections cannot fulfill the needs of their communities. And to recap, Ben, not many, but some publishers are literally not selling to libraries. And from a media point of view, we ran a campaign back in the spring because for the first time in many years, all of the Academy Award nominated films were not available to libraries because, for example, Netflix, which is very much part of the zeitgeist, does not have a library program. And so it means that a number of people cannot participate in culture in the way that they could be expected to. So this is from a very recent article by Brewster Kahle. I can drop all the links in the chat, and there is also a works cited at the end of my slides, because I am still a librarian at my core. But there was a recent article by Brewster Kahle called "I Built the Library. I set out to build the next library of Alexandria. Now I wonder what will happen to libraries in 25 years. Highly recommended. I won't read out the quote, but it is a fabulous article. So fabricating friction. I'm going to just kind of run through this quickly. So licenses are, for example, like artificial gravity. It's a cheat that imposes restraints that may not exist in real life. So on the flip side, producing digital work is lower. So by extension, the cost of the work should be lower, which is not what's happening. So none of the limitations that exist for digital books exist for analog books. And it's worth remembering that libraries really are looking to provide the best materials for their patrons, and publishers exist largely to make money. And so currently within digital licensing schema, for at least trade publications, sometimes, publishers will get 75% of revenue and authors will get 25%. And sometimes you'll ask an author and they'll say, well, at least I'm getting something. And I would say that's wrong, right? Authors should be making much more. And also at the end of the day, libraries do not negotiate author contracts. And I think that they are held to a different standard and they are held to a different set of rules that publishers are not held to. So just to bring up one more equity issue, the Internet Archive just started an interlibrary loan program, which now has 188 institutions participating in, and you can access it at scholar.internetarchive.org. Which I highly recommend. But on a personal level, for me, it's like, I live in the global north. I have access to so many resources. I have access to high-speed internet, and I still can't read many scholarly resources because I don't have access to the Harvard databases anymore. Again, open access is not the only solution. I don't have access to many ebooks, and there's sort of this, shielding your eyes from the fact that you can get many scholarly articles, many ebooks online, anywhere if you want them. But the terms, when you're lending them borrowing from a library, even purchasing them as a consumer, make it so that they cannot operate as an analog book would. And research also shows that people who buy books, no matter where they get the book, right? So I think people who, quote unquote, pirate a book are 3 times as likely to purchase a book. And that's research from the Panorama Project, which is industry research. It's research from their recent study from 2020 called Interactive Media. It's really great. It's in the works cited. And again, so this is from a recent Maria Bustillos article. So she says the point of a library is to preserve, and in order to preserve, a library must own. So I sort of disagree in that. However, I will say that, what this is creating is we're going to look back and we're going to have just a full dearth of content and a full dearth of information from this time period, because corporations have short memories and libraries have long ones. And I also highly recommend checking out this case study. So Maria's case could be one that could be replicated. The Brickhouse Cooperative, which is her cooperative, produced a beautiful PDF, sold it for a fair price, and now we'll see what happens. But what we actually see happening right now is that a few big mega corporations are controlling enormous amounts of the supply chain and are controlling even the distribution from small presses, which means that small presses are always going to be subject to their terms, and publishers are always going to try to maximize profits, while libraries are, again, trying to get the best resources to the public. So, and then I'll get into controlled digital lending. There's an article title from Current Affairs from a number of years ago that I think about a lot, which is don't use bad arguments to make good points. And I feel like with libraries, this happens a lot, particularly when it comes to licensing. So we want the best level of access. So we're just going to kind of give into these licenses. But I think that we can imagine another world and we can envision another world. This is another really great quote from an article by Europeana. And so to sum up, libraries do not need permission to lend books. Another quote from Leila Bailey. So controlled digital lending, we've had multiple sessions on this, so and we're running low on time, so I'm not going to dwell on it. Really look at the session from yesterday or the wonderful session with Kyle Michelle Wu, who coined the term, and Leila Bailey 2 days ago. It keeps the owned to loaned ratio. So if you have one physical copy, you can lend one digital copy and vice versa. I hate proselytizing about the future of libraries, but if you're interested in joining our coalition, Library Futures has a set of principles. We are doing a lot. We are really growing very quickly and operate in 5 issue areas. And this is our coalition. And again, you might see some names you recognize, like EIFL and Knowledge Rights 21, which is Ben's project as well. So just to end, this quote from our board member, Heather Joseph, is really, I think, illustrative of the issue. So people can still get resources with a card, but it's no longer with a library card or student ID, it's with a credit card. And so if you have any questions, please reach out to me. And that's my works cited.
Well, thank you very much, Jenny. That was a really great, very in-depth presentation on some of these aspects of these other issues, like the markets and pricing and the broader issue of licensing. And I guess a question for libraries, how do libraries that operate primarily in the public interest, how do we fare in this increasingly privatized world of getting access and sharing information in line with our public service missions, and this sort of growing tension between those two areas. And I'm reminded of a campaign. I mean, these issues are not particularly new. I mean, we've been grappling with them for many years. There was a campaign in 2012 by the Swedish Library Association, which had a picture of a sort of a publishing executive and saying, this is your meet your new librarian. So it was the publishing executive that is choosing the books that essentially the public library can have in its collection. So so there's still a lot of work to do on that issue. So and now I'm going to turn, thank you, Jenny. I'm going to turn to our final speaker, who is Denise Nicholson. Denise runs a consultancy called Scholarly Horizons since she retired just last year from the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. Those of us in the library world will know Denise well. She has long experience working in libraries on copyright issues, open access and scholarly communications. She's well recognized internationally, regionally, and in South Africa as well for her advocacy in balanced copyright laws in South Africa. And I'd like to, and Denise has won many awards over her career, and most recently, I'd like to congratulate Denise for having got the LIASA Lifetime Achievement Award in 2021. So Denise is going to talk to us about public lending right, which is an issue that is related to the issues that we've just heard about now, digital lending and controlled digital lending. So Denise, I'm going to hand over to you now. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Denise Nicholson from Scholarly Horizons from South Africa, a developing country in transformation. Thanks to the organizers, Teresa, the panelists, the interpreters, for the opportunity to speak to you today on a topic called, what is a public lending right? Libraries play a pivotal role in knowledge sharing, research, and in educating a society. They ensure accessibility for the public and future generations. They provide the treasury of knowledge to inspire authors to create new works and to contribute to the country's cultural heritage. Libraries have a social and moral obligation to provide access to the public. They enable and promote a reading culture, which is much needed in most developing countries. They function under tight budgets and need all their resources to carry out their mandates to serve all stakeholders. They serve everyone and contribute to the free, universal education goals of developing countries. What does public lending mean? Public lending is the free lending of published works by public libraries to the public for the purpose of access to knowledge, whether it be for information, education, research, entertainment, or for domestic, civic purposes, business, or any other uses. Public libraries are funded by the public through their taxes. Libraries are therefore mandated to provide that same public with access to their collections and to provide loan facilities to facilitate access to knowledge. So what is a public lending right? A public lending right, or PLR, is the total opposite of public lending. It is not a right to lend or borrow. It is a levy to lend library works or a tax to read. A PLR is a compensatory right of authors to receive payment from public funds for the perceived loss of sales of their works lent out by public libraries. Currently, 35 countries in total have PLR. There are 30 in the EU, and then there's the UK, New Zealand, Australia, Israel, and Canada. Countries with PLR set their own criteria within or outside the copyright framework. They can elect to include all authors or only national authors, but the latter can only happen outside copyright law, otherwise national treatment would apply. Authors usually have to register to receive PLR payments. In general, developed countries have an established reading culture and advanced educational systems and economies with well-resourced libraries and information services, so they can sustain a PLR system if they choose to. Developing countries, on the other hand, have different levels of education and literacy and often have little or no reading culture. Educational institutions are generally under-resourced and do not always have on-site libraries. Often the only place where students can access learning and other reading material is a public library. A PLR would be an added burden on restricted budgets, whether from state or library budgets. Malawi, one of the 33 least developed countries in Africa, seems to be the only African country to formally recognize a PLR, but as yet it is not functioning. A PLR is funded via different models and is regulated through three broad categories, namely copyright-based, that is entrenched in the copyright law, a sui generis legislation or a separate remuneration right, or via state cultural policy or program. Whichever model is adopted, ultimately the taxpayer bears the burden of PLR payments. Using taxpayers' money, governments fund the bulk of library collections in public libraries. If governments have to pay PLR levies too, the taxpayer will be levied over and over for the same material. Governments in developing countries have far more urgent socioeconomic priorities to consider than subsidizing commercial authors. Libraries themselves have prioritized services and expenses within their limited budgets, so they cannot fund or administer a PLR scheme. In 1992, a WIPO committee of experts on a possible protocol to the Berne Convention rejected PLR because of the negative effect on libraries and education in developing countries. There are no public lending right obligations for any country in the Berne Convention, the TRIPS Agreement, WIPO treaties, or any other international agreements. A PLR is not supported for developing countries, especially for socioeconomic and other reasons. This is confirmed by international library organizations such as EIFL and EIFL, and the regional organization, the African Library and Information Association and Institutions, AFIA. And if you'd like to see their statements, I've given you the links on the slide. Within limited budgets, libraries already assist authors in many ways. Authors are library users themselves. Libraries provide them with information resources, Wi-Fi, the use of computers, as well as advice, inspiration, and safe havens to write. They proactively engage in promoting authors' works, especially local authors. They catalogue their works for accessibility in national and international catalogues and via legal deposit to collect and preserve our cultural heritage. They maintain authors' profiles long-term, make out-of-print works available to the public, and preserve their works for longevity. They are major purchasers of authors' works and promote and support authors. They provide meeting places, reading circles, book clubs, and arrange events to introduce new authors or books, exhibitions, literacy training, and other services to promote authors' works, especially new and not so well-known authors. They are the target market for reference works, and they provide a captive audience for authors. Users read and often buy books after discovering them in the library. There are many ways that authors can be supported without a PLR. Through cultural policies and programs, governments can consider direct grants, reduced sales tax, personal tax rebates, or welfare or pension schemes for authors. They can provide better opportunities for authors to renegotiate contracts or reclaim their rights to copyright reversion, support book fairs and launches and other promotional events, enforce transparency around how much publishers actually earn from authors' works, enable bestseller authors to earn a larger share of royalties from publishers, improve transparency and accountability of collection management organizations, CMOs, to ensure authors get their fair share of royalties. This can be regulated through legislation. Get CMOs to reduce admin fees to allocate more to local authors. Support libraries as venues for promoting literacy, education, and discovering books. It benefits the whole book chain to have a new generation of readers as future book buyers and even future authors. Support libraries as a key part of the book chain infrastructure. Example, legal deposit, national bibliographies, ISBN services, digitization, preservation, etc. And allocate special funds to libraries to purchase more local publications to support local authors. Considerations for libraries, especially in developing countries. There is no legal obligation to adopt a PLR. Existing PLR models are not appropriate for developing countries. CMOs are not the ideal administrators of a PLR. Admin fees of 25% or more are deducted before authors even get paid. They often lack transparency and accountability. Remunerating only national authors may be viewed as discriminatory or unconstitutional. There is a high percentage of foreign publications and donations in public libraries in developing countries. If all authors are included in the scheme, there will be a drain on funds, as the bulk of monies collected will flow to developed countries. If publishers, translators, and editors are included in the scheme, others like indexers, cover artists, and other contributors are also likely to demand compensation. This could have unintended consequences. Example, less money for authors, labor issues, and even protests by others demanding subsidies too. Inadequate copyright limitations and exceptions affect lending of books and other works. This can result in double payments, example, copyright fees and PLR fees, all for the same works. The way the PLR is set up could mean all works are levied, including unused books and non-loan reference works. Publishers can and should improve authors' income by negotiating fairer royalties. In conclusion, the current economic climate, and lack of reading culture in most developing countries do not warrant the introduction of a PLR. The PLR has not been plain sailing in the EU. Ireland, Spain, and a few other countries battled to implement the PLR. France is still debating the PLR. It is not a model for developing countries. PLR will change as the digital world evolves and as more works become open access. There are many other ways of incentivizing and remunerating authors than PLR. Fair and more balanced publisher contracts are the key to a better income for authors. PLR flies in the face of cultural initiatives and policies by governments in developing countries to encourage a reading culture, literacy skills, and to advance education and socioeconomic development within the framework of the UN's SDGs. Developing countries should therefore reject a PLR in their libraries. Thank you for listening to me.
All right. So thanks very much, Denise, for giving us that overview of public lending rights and what are some of the issues for libraries. And we're grateful that you could join us today. I know that you had some issues with your with the power in South Africa, so it's great that you could join us. So now I'm going to open up the floor to all our speakers, and I've got two questions which I'd like to ask, and I invite all any of our speakers to answer as they would like. So the first question, I was just mindful that the title of our session is Copyright and Licensing Challenges for Libraries, and much of our conversation has necessarily focused on licensing, and we've talked a lot about licensing and some of the issues for libraries around licensing. So my question would be, is what in your view is the role of copyright in regulating access to the digital age, and how can we get that interplay between copyright and licensing, that does exist and is, as Jennie said, is used, extensively as part of the way of life of libraries. So how can we get that interplay between copyright and licensing rights, so we get that balance between the library rights that are set out in law and the provisions in licenses that are negotiated and by libraries. So I'd like to ask any of our speakers if they'd like to respond, and maybe anyone likes to put up their hand, or if anyone would like to respond. So I see Denise's hand. Okay, I see Denise's hand first, and then I think maybe Ben, and then we have Jennie. Thanks, Denise.
Okay, I would say that a number of things could be regulated within the copyright law. South Africa has a copyright amendment bill before Parliament at the moment. It's very contested by rights holders and entertainment industries and CMOs. And one of the things that we do have in the bill, and that is one of the reasons why it's been opposed so strongly, is that CMOs will be regulated. Currently, they run businesses on their own, and there's no accountability. They do an annual report, but it's very vague. The law will regulate that they have to register first of all, and then they will be audited on an annual basis, and they will have to pay fairer royalties. And that is one way that authors will get a better deal, and that there'll be a fairer deal all round. The second thing is that we've introduced clause for unenforceable contracts. In many cases, publishers have restrictive copyright laws so much that they override your copyright exceptions. And there's nothing you can do at the moment. So our law does have a clause saying that if exceptions are overridden, then the contract would be unenforceable. And this is something that is in the EIFL model copyright laws, so other countries could have a look at this as well. I think it's a very interesting and helpful thing. A lot of the lawyers are arguing that, oh, we're going to destroy contract law, but it's essentially only unenforceable if you override something that is lawful. So, for example, in South Africa, the law anywhere around the world is if you are allowed to go through a green traffic light. And a license might say that you're not allowed to. And in that case, it would be unenforceable because it's overriding something that's lawful. And the same thing with exceptions. If it overrides anything that is an exception and a lawful one, then the law would be unenforceable. So there are two examples, I think, where copyright law could actually, regulate and help authors and others.
Okay, thank you, Denise. Ben, did I see your hand?
Yeah. So I think one of the challenges of the transition from analog to digital is that for a long time, legislatures have just abrogated all responsibility around protecting the public interest and thinking about limitations and exceptions. I'm hoping that maybe the tide is changing on this. In 2014 in the UK, we saw many of our public interest exceptions becoming non-overridable by contract. And then in 2019, in the Digital Single Market Directive, we've seen 3 exceptions being protected from licensing. So, and I don't think in Europe that debate's going to go away. And in a country not a million miles away from where I am at the moment, I don't think this is in the public domain. They're also starting to look at the interplay of contracts and licensing, realizing that essentially lawmakers have no role if everything is regulated by private contracts. So I'm hoping that maybe some legislatures are sort of waking up to this. And I certainly think in Europe, it won't stop at these three exceptions. And I think at a practical level, I would urge large libraries to employ publishers to do licensing back on publishers. I think often, from my humble personal experience, librarians are too meek and mild in their contractual negotiations with publishers. I think it's really important that you get people who have, a lot of negotiating experience and not accept the appalling contracts that are sometimes offered to libraries. So I think, there's 3 things to think about there.
Okay, thanks, Ben. And I think also another European directive is the Marrakesh Directive. I think that also has a contract, has a provision in there.
Can't remember. I know the Marrakesh Treaty didn't, but I think
the Marrakesh
right.
Treaty didn't, but the directive, did. Yeah. And the database directive as well, which is like from 1996, where there was a recognition already by the legislator that if it's a database, it is governed, access is governed by a license. So they saw already then that there was a need to, to protect the exceptions. So yeah, okay, thank you. Jennie.
I couldn't agree more with Denise and with Ben. Also, I am not a lawyer. I think I might be the only non-lawyer on this panel, but I get the opportunity to work with a lot of lawyers. And so, in the United States, we have this this sort of paradigm where copyright has become more restrictive over time. So while we do have a fairly flexible fair use, we have flexible fair use and a number of exceptions and limitations, the question still remains, like, how are they applied in the digital world? So we also do have the issue of contracts replacing any kind of copyright law that we would recognize in many cases. So one of the key differences where I think this is pretty illustrative is the ebook laws in Maryland, New York, and Rhode Island, less so in Rhode Island because of our involvement in it, but Maryland and New York at least operated on a licensing scheme. It said that, that they had to license on quote unquote reasonable terms. And so that created a compulsory licensing scheme, which was not applicable and was very easily taken down by the Association of American Publishers. We are working on a uniform law, which I think is okay to say. And if you join our policy community, you can find out more about it. So we were working on this uniform law that operates on the basis of contract law. So if you contract with a publisher, if a state contracts with a publisher or a state institution contracts with a publisher, it must follow the following rules. So it must offer ownership rights. It must offer, non-exploitative licensing if it is a licensing scheme. And so for Kyle Courtney, again, our board chair, what he proposes is eventually we would love to get to a controlled digital lending federal law. But of course, this moves very slowly. People do not care about copyright in the same way that they care about other topics, even though we all believe and know that copyright is of utmost importance. And so, that might look like, for example, an amendment to copyright law for what he calls 109A, where 109 is first sale. So 109A is the right to digital first sale, particularly for libraries, particularly for public institutions. And so that's sort of the dream and the hope. But knowing how slowly these things move, I would highly recommend, also I keep saying that, but I would check out our policy paper as well, which goes over some of the reasons why a controlled digital lending bill would be a strong endorsement for equity within copyright regimes, at least within the United States. And again, I really cannot agree more with Denise and Ben on their comments around contracts and around contract enforcement as well.
Okay, thank you. Ariadna, did you have anything to add?
Maybe just a general thought, and it doesn't relate so much on the relation between law and contracts, but I definitely agree with everything that's been said so far. But generally speaking, it would be great to see copyright legislators legislate with a clear and transparent purpose in mind, because it is difficult to understand why certain measures are adopted and how they contribute to the objectives of fostering innovation and creativity that I always understood as being the objectives that copyright serves. And also legislate being mindful of collateral damages that need to be cared about. It's not okay to just establish a law and if people if it has negative consequences on certain public interest activities, too bad. This should be taken care of as well.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I guess that also that's bringing us back to the reminding us of the importance of having a good set of exceptions in your law. Because even if you have a contract override clause or a clause that protects your exceptions in your copyright law from override by licenses, that's of limited value if you have no exceptions or if you have very few exceptions. So they really kind of work together, I think, and that's how we have to try and get that balance right. Have your core set of good exceptions, and then have those exceptions protected from being taken away either by contract or by technological protection measures. Because as we used to say, otherwise you end up with a situation where the lawmaker is giving with one hand and then taking away with the other. So that brings me on to then my second question, which I'll ask the panel, which we could actually use this contract as an example. But my question was, like, from the issues that we have described, how do you think they can be best resolved? So should they be resolved at a national level, at a regional level, or at an international level? And what issues transcend borders? So what issues require some international action? And we could even just take the contract one as an example. So is that something that we should all be working for as a national level, or should we be trying to have some, advocacy around a regional solution, or maybe even an international one as well? So are there any ideas?
Can I go first?
Yeah,
I think
sure.
we have to look at all levels. We have to look at national, regional, and international. But I do think that they go at the same time. I mean, I'm just looking at the treaty proposals at WIPO for libraries and archives. They've been going for what, 14 years or something. But the bill in South Africa has been going for as long as that, maybe 2 years later. We've been debating it. It's been going through all sorts of processes. It's gone back to Parliament. We had the US fighting us because we want fair use. The US trade representative and the EU wrote to our government, to stall it, and they did. They sent it back to Parliament, and now it's going to probably take another year. So what we want in our legislation, a lot of it we took from the WIPO proposals, so they're in our law. We took from EIFL model law, but at the same time, they're talking at the international level. So if we're doing it at all levels, maybe at some stage, one of them will come through for us. So I think we have to just look at all avenues. Also, I put a note in the chat that CDL in South Africa isn't even under discussion at the moment. I've been sending things to our lobby organizations, but once the copyright bill is passed, then we have to look at quite a number of our national legislation relating to libraries and archives and cultural heritage. And I would certainly like any clauses or any thing that we could put in on CDL there as well, because I think as soon as we can, we must get it into our legislation as well. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Denise. Ben.
Again, really just to echo Denise there, I haven't really thought about controlled digital lending in terms of cross-border issues, but in terms of the issues that I raised, I mean, certainly Interlibrary Loan has a strong cross-border aspect to it. Data mining, again, strongly cross-border. So it really does require an international response, given that education and learning in 2021 is highly international. So the fact that we have these little silos, I mean, less so within the European Union. My own country has created its own little silo for rather odd reasons that no one really understands, but education and research is international. The solution has to be international.
Yes, and in fact, I'll ask a follow-up question to Ariadna, sort of in relation to that, because when Ariadna, when you were describing the European, the Digital Single Market Directive, and how that has been helpful to Europeana and libraries in Europe, so that you're operating in a kind of a cross-border scenarios within the European Union. So you've got almost like a cultural wall around Europe. But of course, culture is not regional. Culture is international, and even to give an example from my own country, James Joyce, the Nobel Prize winning the author, you'll find material about James Joyce in libraries in Ireland, of course, but you'd also find special collections about James Joyce in universities in the US, and you'll find information in Switzerland where he died. So you have a situation where you will have European scholars will need to get access to collections and information about Europe that are held outside of Europe, and vice versa. You have scholars who want to learn about European collections and get access who are outside Europe. So how does that operate then in this? How does this European solution work in this international environment?
Thanks, Teresa. I think that's a very good question, but I think I would have to give a bit more thought to. But yeah, my first thought is that it would depend very much on the type of exception or context that we're talking about. But I'm sure that in many situations we would encounter challenges in the fact that certain exceptions are applicable to certain countries, but not outside of these countries. And definitely the online space is completely mindless of these actual borders. So it still feels very artificial the way our laws are designed as compared to how cultural heritage institutions want to operate online. So I'm aware that I'm not really answering your question, but I would have to give a bit more thought to that very specific point, I think. And even in the European context, it's like the European legislator has taken a step towards harmonization, but by choosing to do that through a directive, it still gives some discretionality to every member state. So differences, as we see how the transposition is undertaken in every country, differences are still flourishing. And I'm sure even though I cannot complain that we're progressing towards harmonization, it could be even stronger when it comes to exceptions.
Okay, thank you. Jennie Rose, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so I think to answer your first question more than your second question, but this, again, I agree with all the speakers, and it's so wonderful when everyone is very much on the same page. But I will also say that one of the frameworks where I think about this also is first off, the way in which the current paradigm really just creates North American hegemony. So to take a very specific example from, say, the University of California. So there was a recent agreement where, a lot of large universities in the United States are cutting big deals with Elsevier. And this is from the open access context. So the University of California cut their deal with Elsevier. Then when they came back, the eventual agreement that they made was that UC research, which is actually almost 10% of research in the United States, will be open access, which is great for UC, but not great for everyone else. And these transformative agreements came out of the European context. So that is necessarily international. And, that is not to place blame on the many people who negotiated this contract over years, but it is also sort of, I think in some ways, a lack of imagination for how we can come together in an international context and actually address the issues of closed off, or what is being called in a recent podcast series with Glenn Moody and Glenn Frank, walled culture, that it is creating walls that are largely artificial, and that these artificial walls are enforcing and reestablishing just complete hegemony for the North American context and the North American way of doing research. Was the book Shadow Libraries, which talked about this in particular when it comes to education and to universities. But I actually don't know if there's enough discussed in the context of, as Denise was talking about, of public libraries and public education, and what this really means. Climate change is international. Pandemics are international. This will not be, I hope it is, but this will not be the last time that internationally we see an enormous restriction on global travel, and we see an enormous restriction on access to physical resources. And so there needs to be an international solution for that. That's not what we've been seeing, which is very much the status quo. And last, one of the challenges that I would really like to bring to this panel is that one of the things that is very strange, I think, about the internet, the way that the internet works right now, is it makes things that were once legal, that would be legal in real life. So, for example, lending a book to someone, if you have it, or making a photocopy of a book, if you have it, those things are perfectly legal in real life. It makes them illegal. And I don't think that's a world that any of us want to see, particularly as people who work in and care about the public interest.
Thank you. Ben, you would like to respond?
I think it was the trigger word hegemony from Jennie that sort of got me thinking about the sort of different standards that we see at play in terms of digital information. So we have these very high walls which are created by copyright, and certainly one prominent Japanese academic thinking about software law, which is of course governed by copyright most frequently. They argue that the reason that the US proposed and pushed copyright as being the intellectual property medium that protects software, because it's arcane, difficult, life plus 50, 60, 70 years. It was a way of protecting the US software industry from protection from competitors like Japan. So sort of in and around software and creative industry materials, we see these very high walled silos. And yet, if we look at free trade agreements, what's going on is the States and Japan, through free trade agreements, are trying to ensure that data and information flows with no borders at all. So they are strongly opposing and working at the WTO level, as well as through regional trade agreements, to ensure that data travels from the global north and the global south to predominantly American industries and Japanese industries in the form of robotics and driverless cars. So there they want personal and non-personal data to have no borders, so the data can travel to protect their hegemonic position or nascent hegemonic position in terms of AI and these frontier technologies. So it's kind of interesting that in one sphere we see high walls because it traditionally arguably suited these dominant powers, and yet in the new data economy we see America pushing entirely in the opposite direction, just for what it's worth.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot of aspects and a lot of issues to think about, and I'm looking at the clock, and we're going to start wrapping up now. But thinking of, like, the title of our session is Copyright and Licensing Challenges for Libraries. I think next time we'll have a session on copyright and libraries solutions for libraries, so that we can also, tease out in more detail the solutions, because I think there's probably, as we've heard, there's a lot of different issues and different solutions for different issues. Some require clearly an international response, and then some. But as Denise mentioned, we need to be working really at all levels, because there is there's everything is connected: national laws and FTAs, regional FTAs, and international as well. So there's a lot of interaction, and in many cases it's the same officials who are dealing with these issues at all of these different levels. So with that, I'd like to ask if there's any final comments from any of our panelists.
Yeah, I was actually just thinking, and this is very much built from Ariadna's example of public domain and open licensing, and I don't want to get into a whole new topic of conversation right before we end, but I did start off my talk by saying, provocatively, that there really is no fair licensing arrangement for libraries. And I would just like to add, with the exception of Creative Commons or public domain, both CC and also the public domain mark have proven over the years to be, frankly, fairly easily exploited by large academic resources, but when used well in contexts like in Europeana and in conjunction with rights statements, I think that they can be incredibly liberatory and incredibly transformative for many cultural heritage organizations and libraries.
Yes, there's the licensing landscape is complex and interesting. So with that, I'd like to wrap up our session. I've enjoyed the conversation. I've learned new things and got lots of new references and resources, and I'm sure we'll be sharing our slides with all those references as well. I'd like to thank all our speakers who've joined us from all over the world, in Barcelona, in Tokyo, in Boston, and in Johannesburg. And me, myself, I'm in Dublin, in Ireland. I'd also like to thank, in particular, the interpreters. I hope that we behaved ourselves and spoke